this class to the church before, but he is, let me see if I can find your information here. John Vest, who will be teaching us on the New Reformers, Entrepreneurial, Missionaries, in Post-Christendom America. He describes himself as a church hacker. I hope that's a good thing. Hacker's usually not a good thing, but anyway, that's a good thing. Attempting to overcome the limitations of the church as we know it. He currently serves as the visiting assistant professor of evangelism at Union Presbyterian Seminary, not cemetery, and works with the Presbytery of the James in areas of evangelism, new church development, and church revitalization. Let's hear it for John.
It's great to be here, and so what exactly is this class? The John Trotty class. Okay. All right. So yeah, every time, this is my third time at First Church, and each time has been with a different group, and it's been a different room, and so I just don't really know what to expect until I get here, but that's totally fine. Maybe I should have had this set up, but while I'm loading this up, to explain what I mean by church hacker. So in the vernacular today, a hacker is a bad guy that breaks into your computer or some sort of computer system and tries to wreak havoc. In the original use of that term, hacker, it was the people that invented our computer systems and the internet and all of the different things that make life the way they are today. And they came from very different sort of pre-computer technologies, and they were engineers that were interested in taking either software or hardware problems and trying to create new and better and sort of ingenious and fun ways of overcoming the limitations of what they were presented with. And because of that, and so when you talk about like a life hack today is something that maybe you've heard, that's a way to try to like make your life easier by some sort of creative sort of thing. So that's really originally what a hacker was someone that was trying to take these problems and in a fun and creative and innovative way, figure out some new way of doing it. And I sort of see myself as that in the church, because a lot of what we're doing still works, but a lot hasn't. And that's been a lot of what my work is to say we are in the period that we often talk about as Post-Christendom, which is this period in our history where Christianity, mainline Protestantism in particular, since that's where we're in the midst of, is no longer at the center of American culture in the way that it was. And we're actually going to have a longer look at that today, because I want to connect this to our heritage of the Reformation, since we just celebrated the 500th anniversary on Tuesday of Martin Luther's 95 Theses. And this year is a 500th year anniversary of the beginning of the Reformation. And I understand y'all have done some Reformation work already, so this hopefully will maybe supplement that, and at least from my perspective, try to connect it to where we are in our period of time today. And like, what does this mean for us as Christians in a particular tradition in this moment of time in American and global history? So that's really what I'm going to try to do. My day job, as you heard, is to teach evangelism at the seminary, but also to resource churches in our presbytery in the areas of evangelism and church revitalization and new church development. And again, a lot of that is to say that how can we as a presbytery of the James, and this is I guess my particular take or my agenda, is to think strategically about who we are in this part of Virginia and what it is that God's calling us to do and to be. And so this all fits within that broad swath of broad stroke of what it is that I do. So I'm happy to be here. I like to begin a lot of my times, especially for those who had a horrible college football day the day before. I'm among your ranks. I'm a Florida Gators fan. And we've just had an abysmal season that can't get over soon enough.
You could have been Ohio State, you know.
Oh my goodness. I couldn't believe that game. Anyway, so I like to begin with a Lectio Divina, a prayer form that maybe you're familiar with and maybe you're not. Most of our prayer forms have to do with us speaking to God. So that's the kind of prayer that we mostly employ in worship in a context like this. Lectio Divina is an ancient prayer form that's about us listening for God through reading short passages of Scripture in a repetitive fashion. So the idea here is to listen to what God may be speaking through some sort of Scripture passage. And so I'll read this 3 times with a little bit of silence between each one. And this is one that I've been using a lot in classes and workshops and teachings like this, because it presents an interesting sort of, I think, challenge for us in terms of how we relate to our history. And what does that mean for where we are right now? So if you want to close your eyes, you can. If you want to read this, you can. I'll have just a little bit of silence. And the idea here is just, I'm not going to give you too many directions. Just listen to what God may speak to you, what resonates, what doesn't resonate, what maybe creates some challenge and some difficulty for you. So let's begin with this, a little bit of silence, and I'll read it 3 times with some silence after each one. Let's pray. Don't remember the prior things. Don't ponder ancient history. Look, I'm doing a new thing. Now it sprouts up. Don't you recognize it? I'm making a way in the desert, paths in the wilderness. Don't remember the prior things. Don't ponder ancient history. Look, I'm doing a new thing. Now it sprouts up. Don't you recognize it? I'm making a way in the desert, paths in the wilderness. Don't remember the prior things. Don't ponder ancient history. Look, I'm doing a new thing. Now it sprouts up. Don't you recognize it? I'm making a way in the desert, paths in the wilderness. Amen. So what did you hear in this morning? What resonates for you, or what do you find challenging or interesting? Y'all do talk in this class, right?
Yeah.
I know I'm in a Presbyterian room.
We usually don't have a problem with that.
Okay, good. All right. So what do you hear here?
God is making a way.
God's making a way. Okay, good. What else?
I love that, don't remember the prior things.
Why do you love that? What is it about that that speaks to you?
Oh, like, don't go back an hour or so.
Not even an hour. You were totally living in the forward, okay? All right, how about other folks?
Seems to me it's saying how difficult what he's trying, or she is trying to do. Making a way in the desert and paths in wilderness can be thick and.
Yeah. Right, good.
So,
Man.
I think prior things could include a lot of regrets and feeling like you've missed things that you should have gotten. And I think the prophets say, don't dwell on that. Look at what's happening.
Okay.
how does this comport with the Bible? The history of mankind, prior things don't ponder ancient history. So is this kind of in juxtaposition to that?
Yeah, and it's a bit paradoxical, right? I mean, because
Right.
it's in the Bible. And it's in fact, a portion of the Bible that, for us at least, is in the past, right? So, I mean, this is from the prophet Isaiah, and this is an exilic prophecy, an exilic statement for people who are in exile, wanting to know what's the future for us. So on the one hand, it's all those bad things, not just the regrets, but the failures, the embarrassments, the humiliations, these things that we've suffered. Don't dwell on that, I mean, because God's doing something new. God's doing something new for us in this time and place. But at the same time, the entire Bible exists because we're not to forget the past, right? We're not to just move on from our past. So what's the relationship there between the newness of what God is doing now and our relationship to the past? Why do you have this class?
Well, it's up to us to remember ancient history, because as a very wise man once said, if we don't remember our history, we're liable to repeat it.
Sure.
And I think we're asking God, don't hold it against us, but let us remember it so that we can learn from it.
So that's an interesting spin, right? So we want to remember our past, but don't hold it against us.
Right.
Yeah, okay, what else?
Well, if we're doing a new thing and we're still in the past, we're not doing the new thing.
Right, okay. That's a good point, yeah. I tend, as sort of my, my job title might indicate, and the way that I describe it as being a church hacker, that I tend to live in the newness, right? That I tend to really be invested in that, right? For me, God is pulling us forward into a future, whether we like it or not. God is pulling us forward, and we have a role to play in that newness. This passage for me, I mean, is a helpful reminder, if we sort of take this whole conversation, that we can't do that without being mindful of where we've come. And in fact, we can't understand what's new unless we understand what's been and where we've come from. And in fact, and again, this is in the context of thinking about newness in the context of the 500th anniversary of the beginning of the Reformation, that we can't understand our current reality and the current challenges of church without thinking about the last 500 years of how that's played out. And what is interesting to me, and the premise for what I want to do with us today and next week, is that mostly unintentionally, the reality that we live in, with all the good and the bad, is a direct result of what Martin Luther did 500 years ago. And that to sort of take stock of that is part of what it means for us to live into that Reformation. And as other people have made the case, we're in another cycle of revolution or reformation or change or update, or however you want to, whatever word you want to use, awakening. We're in another stage of that, and to think about where we've been in relation to that is really important. So let me just first, very briefly, if you've seen me do other presentations, you know that I can dwell on this for a long time. This is going to be the extreme short version of saying where we are and sort of the reality the realities that we face that seem to me to really be drivers of this question of what it means to do something new. The two twin headlines of religion in the United States, and really all of North America, but let's think about the United States. One is the overall decline of all forms of Protestantism. Numeric decline, but also cultural decline, in the sense that there are less of us now than there were 50 or 60 years ago. And what's important about this, and what I like to always lift up, because this still, I think, hasn't necessarily sunk in to everyone in the United States yet, is that this is not just mainline Protestants like us, like Presbyterians, that have been declining for, without stop or abatement for 50 years straight. And I'll show you that slide in a minute. But this also now includes even evangelical denominations like the Southern Baptist Church, which is actually where I was raised, which have either flatlined or started to decline numerically as well. Not only this, again, in this 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation, in 2012, I think, if my memory serves, was the tipping point where we no longer have a Protestant majority in the United States. Up until 2012, there was at least 50% of all Americans identified as Protestants. In 2012, that dipped, and now it's like 48% of Americans identify as Protestants.
Has Catholicism increased?
No. I'll show you a slide in just a minute. No one's increasing, except non-religious people. So I'll show you that in a minute. Which I guess is the other twin headlines, is what we typically call the rise of the nuns. N-O-N-E-S, not N-U-N-S, which if we had more of those, the world would be a better place. But this, N-O-N-E-S, are folks that claim no religious affiliation. So on like a survey, if they're asked, are you a Presbyterian, a Methodist, a Catholic, an Episcopalian, or none of the above? Of course, the list would be more exhaustive than that. They say none of the above. And this has been in the news a lot for the last, well, at least the news that I look at, religion news, for the last decade, because this has really been on the rise. I'll show you, this is I know you can't probably read this, but that's okay. The group that does a lot of this research, that makes a lot of the headlines, is the Pew Research Group. And so every couple years they release new data. This is up through 2014. So this represents the change from 2007 to 2014. I'm assuming that sooner or later they'll release another round of this, which will give us more up-to-date numbers. But what this shows, if you can't read the fine print, that's okay. All you need to know is there's 3 red lines going down. That's evangelical Protestants, Catholics, and mainline Protestants, who are all, relative to the overall population of the United States, losing their share of the population. So while there are, in fact, some evangelical Protestant groups, notably Pentecostals, that may be growing in a strict numerical sense, in the sense that there's more of them this year than there were last year. Again, that's a relatively small pocket even within evangelical Protestants, or in some cases, there's a Catholic increase in certain areas of the United States. Overall, relative to the population growth of our country, everyone is on a decline, except these two. This is the less steep or non-Christian faiths. So relative to the overall population, there are more non-Christian faiths in the U.S., but the steepest there is the unaffiliated. That's the nuns, which in 2007 represented 16% of the U.S. population, and in 2014, almost 23%. I'm sure right now it's a quarter of all Americans. When this really sort of caught the news was in 2012, when it was 20%. So at that point, it was 1 in 5 Americans say they have no religious affiliation. In 2014, that was 23. I'm sure it's 1 in 4 now. It may be higher. So this is continuing to rise year after year. And we could dig into what all that means, and maybe next week we'll get into some of that in terms of why folks are leaving or some of those. But suffice it to say, the overall narrative, and this is a different graph that sort of takes into consideration all of the different things that we typically measure when we think about religiosity. So church membership, church attendance, and giving. If you take all those things together from 1950s to now, it's a pretty significant decrease. Because we're Presbyterians, I like to show this. I mean, I like to, I don't get pleasure from it, but the reality is that this is what that membership decline looks like for the Presbyterian Church USA. Now, clearly, before 1983, which was reunion, you'll know that everything back here was two separate denominations, but that's the aggregate of the membership of those two denominations that ended up becoming the Presbyterian Church USA. But all this is to show that there's less than half as many Presbyterians in the PCUSA as there were in 1960. Which, you know, if you were doing any other kind of organization or industry, you would look at that and say, that's a failure. That's a disaster. We tend to not call it a failure or a disaster for a variety of reasons, most of which I think are denial of the reality. And we can talk about, in fact, where I want us to end today is to think a little bit about why does this matter? Because especially in a church like this, where things seem to be going pretty well, right? I'm talking to a room full of Presbyterians. You'll have a room full of folks worshiping downstairs. This doesn't seem to be a failure. This isn't representative of the entire denomination. And not only that, and this is where I think maybe this number, taken on within our own conversation, maybe this looks bad enough, but if you think about it, this represents somewhere like, around 2 or 3% of the entire US population. We have a pretty low penetration into culture, right? So we tend to argue with ourselves as Presbyterians a lot, if you haven't noticed, because we think that what we're doing is really important, and we all have different perspectives on what's important and what really matters, but we're arguing over a 2 to 3% of the entire US population. And there's not a whole lot of indication, and that's actually, our percentage is even lower. We're about 1.5 million PCUSA people right now. That 2 to 3% is all Presbyterians, so the ones that have left us or we've left them behind. So in terms of our kind of influence and our status and our culture, this is a significant decrease from what has been in the past. Yes, sir.
This represents, well, my question is religion in the United States in general decreasing, religious people who claim to be religious in some respect? Everybody's declining at that rate?
Maybe not at this rate. Everyone in terms of organized institutional religion, except for, like I said, Pentecostals, really are declining in terms of membership. Now that doesn't mean, and this is what we'll get into more next week, this doesn't mean that the overall spirituality of the United States has drastically changed, or depending on how you measure that, right? So in terms of saying we believe in God or we believe in some kind of higher power, we're still a remarkably spiritual or faithful, however you want to describe it, nation. I mean, there's only around, I think, 7% of people in the United States that say they're atheists, right? They say we don't believe in anything. But a significant fewer portion of that 93% attend some sort of organized religion, like what we're doing right now. So that's where there's a bigger gap, and actually that's where I am most interested in, because we continue to only, you'll hear me say more about this next week, we continue to really only serve the needs of the folks that are coming to places like this, whereas there's a whole lot of other folks that are actually very similar to us, with the main difference being we come here on Sunday and they don't. And how can we create opportunities for meaningful relationship and collaboration with folks like that? That to me is some of the challenge of when I'm talking about, at least in the context of these classes, the new Reformation. If I was to say, what does the Reformation look like today? What's the Reformation that we're experiencing? It's a shift away from this to a different kind of spirituality. And I think that we still have a role to play in that. And that's what I'll talk about some more next week. And that's going to require what I'm talking about is entrepreneurial ministry, because we can't just rely on the patterns and the forms and the structures that we've always had, because they're not working. We have to be able to create new things. And that's where I think we're having a lag, is figuring out how to do that. Any other thoughts on this before we move on? Yes?
I think one of the sad things, and of course all of us here, except for young people, have lived through the loss of Christendom. I mean, I remember it very well. But I'm very sad that we don't have the power to speak to the government or to the citizens the way it was before, with very influential ministers who would speak out. And I think that's a big loss.
Well, and that's where, like, hold that thought, because that's where I want to come to say, like, why does this matter? And what do we believe about our role in society? And why is that important? Because that's kind of where this gets to, because part of what this is about, the story that we're going to take a little snapshot of today, is about the complete redefinition and revolution of the relationship between religion and society.
Right.
And we can't stress how different the last 100 years, like how different we are now from 500 years ago. And so part of this, and I kind of ruined the slide by putting it up by mistake, is to say that everything that I've just said is Martin Luther's fault. Or at least one way to think about it, is that even like this secularization, the post-Christendom, the unraveling of Christendom in Europe and in the United States ultimately traces back to what Luther thought would be a relatively minor, though it was important, but he wasn't trying to do all of that, right? He was trying to make one sort of specific course correction for the church that he actually originally didn't dream of leaving until it became clear that he had no choice, and then a whole lot of other people got on board and said, this is going to change the way that we think about this as well. A book that I've been reading to sort of help me think through this. There's a couple books that have come out recently, again, to help us think about the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, and I'll mention another one next week. But this one by Brad Gregory, Rebel in the Ranks, if you can't read that, Martin Luther, the Reformation, and the conflicts that continue to shape our world. And a quote from like the first page. Martin Luther would be horrified by most of the long-term outcomes of the Reformation, as would John Calvin, the other most influential Protestant reformer of the 16th century. And so what he means by that, sort of just a short little list, is the modern individual freedom and autonomy, modern democratic states, consumer capitalism, modern religious toleration, and the modern separation of church and state. These things that we take for granted and are all really cornerstones and bedrocks of what it means to be the United States. Martin Luther and John Calvin would be horrified that what they were doing in Europe 500 years ago resulted in what we experience today. And this book is a really good long form exposition of what that looks like and what that means. And I want to give you just some snapshots about that and how we can trace that change through time, and then we'll talk about why that matters. So just let me pause there. Has anyone read this book, or is anyone like saying this is ridiculous? Luther didn't cause all this. Yeah, yes, sir.
Just as I think perhaps a preview of what you're going to say, that Martin Luther challenged the autocratic nature of the church, which set up the machinery that ended up leading to the end of autocratic rule in government.
Yeah.
That's what this would say?
Absolutely, yeah, for sure. So part of that is to say what existed 500 years ago was what we could call the Latin Christendom. And what that means is, when we talk about Christendom as a concept, that's a shorthand way of saying that the church and culture, but even more than that, government and, prior to the modern age, empire, were completely intertwined, right? And so that began with Constantine, who set into motion Christianity becoming the official religion of the Roman Empire. And once that actually happened, and the Roman Empire and the church became one, that created a political religious entity that dominated the Western world for a long, long time. And part of what we're experiencing now is the unraveling of that on a very advanced scale. But if we start with 500 years ago, and the world in which Luther was born into, in the world in which Luther did what Luther did, and John Calvin following him, Latin Christendom was a way of saying Europe was completely Christianized. And Christianity wasn't sort of an additional thing that was layered over life. It was completely intertwined into every aspect of life. So there was no aspect of life that was devoid or separated from religion. And if there was to be said, like this was a Christian empire that was split up into different areas at that point, that was true, right? Christianity was completely dominant in that. So what Luther did in the 16th century, which there had been reformers before Luther who had said the church isn't doing what the church should be doing all throughout the medieval period. We can look at those and say they were challenging the church to be better, to not be so corrupt, not be so greedy or evil or whatever. But what Luther did that was different was he challenged the doctrines of the church. So it started with a practice, right? So it didn't start off by challenging the doctrines of the church. That would sort of come later. But it started more with the practice and the selling of indulgences, but became a theological challenge to the church. And that opened up a Pandora's box of, well, if we can all make determinations about what to believe, this leads then down the road to this sort of free-for-all that we continue to experience. Now, the next piece of this that is important is what we call the wars of religion. And this is from like the 1520s to the 1650s or 40s. Now these weren't just like arguments or disputes. These were all out bloody wars where people were fighting with each other now, Protestants primarily, but also Catholics, fighting with each other over what to believe, because Christianity was so intertwined with the political realities that they lived in. This wasn't just Lutherans and Presbyterians and Catholics saying we have some minor differences on the theory of atonement. This was, my army is going to come and fight your army because we're wrestling for control of Europe. And so during this time of religious bloody wars, or at the end of it, Europe was understandably depleted and understandably weary and understandably exacerbated, and said maybe religion isn't the best way to start to organize our way of thinking, or maybe there are ways beyond religion because we haven't resolved these wars. And that's really, I think, the biggest thing that the Reformation did or didn't do was resolve any of the conflicts that it started, right? So if Luther's Reformation, or Calvin's, or pick either one, had won in the sense that it completely replaced not only the Roman Catholic Church but all the other Protestant churches, you could have gone back to a different form of Christendom. It would have been a Protestant, or one particular Protestant Christendom, like say a Lutheran Christendom, or Reformed or Calvinistic or Presbyterian Christendom. That could have happened, but that didn't happen. None of these things were resolved, and there was no pope on the Protestant side to say this is what is real, and this is what the final say is. So because none of these things were resolved through the theological debates and then through the actual wars, you had a question beginning at the last part of the 17th century, but then definitely in the 18th century, maybe religion isn't the best way to structure and organize our way of thinking and how we relate to each other. So you have in the 18th century in particular, the Enlightenment. What's the Enlightenment about?
Rights of man.
Yeah, and eventually women. But yeah, that instead of religion or mythology or superstition controlling the way that we think, reason and then ultimately science and philosophy and logic is what should dictate the way we live together and the way we structure our society. So you have, beginning there in the 18th century, this further chipping away of the hold that Christianity has on culture. Then the next sort of step in that becomes really important for us is the United States. The United States, in almost every respect, is the kind of perfect and natural outcome of the Reformation and the Enlightenment coming together. That a nation built on Enlightenment ideals and the notion of religious tolerance or religious freedom, which was another way of saying we're not going to resolve these conflicts. Instead of resolving these conflicts and saying the United States will be based on one religion, Thomas Jefferson and others made the strong case, persuasive case, that we're going to allow every religion, and it will, no religion will be privileged, no religion will be excluded, and that all comes together to really be the perfect storm of Reformation and Enlightenment changes that creates what we we experience here. Now, that came into a particular version in the 18th century and the beginning of the United States. What was interesting is in the 19th century, you all familiar with Alexis de Tocqueville? He was a French writer, thinker in the 19th century, early 19th century, who made a very famous series of trips to the United States in the 1830s and then wrote about them for his folks back in Europe. And it's a treasure trove of what made America, I can't say this anymore, like what made America great, and why America works. Because a lot of folks in Europe didn't think that this was going to work, right? But it worked really well.
He was very enthusiastic, that's for sure.
Yeah, and so Tocqueville and others, but Tocqueville in particular, I've noticed a lot of people turning back to Tocqueville to say, what did he see in this sort of nascent period of the United States, 50 years after the Declaration of Independence? And what he saw, in part, and this is important, was that, and this was a bit of a paradox for him, that how could a nation built on religious diversity achieve a high degree of unity that was based in religion? And so what he found as a bit of a paradox was that even though all sorts of different Protestant, in particular, versions of Christianity existed in the United States, they all kind of agreed on what he, I don't think he used this word, but what we could say was sort of a Protestant ethos or a Protestant coalition of morals and values that were directed toward making the country succeed. And so he saw that all of the Protestant churches in the United States had this coming together, and I think we could talk about then in the United States that was what we might call a Protestant Christendom. So it's true that there was never an officially sanctioned church or religion in the United States, but it's not true to say that we never have been a Christian nation, right? We weren't an established Christian state like exists in Europe still to this day, right? That there are state religions, and that would be a whole other talk to see about how that has unraveled and failed in Europe. So we never had an official version of Christianity, but it is true. This, in the culture wars of the last 10 or 20, 30 years, this has been sort of a debate. Is America a Christian nation, or was it ever a Christian nation? Regardless of what you think about right now, America was a Christian nation, a Protestant nation, and so that shift from no longer having a Protestant majority, this is why everything's going sort of haywire now, because what was part of our founding DNA is being upended. And so Tocqueville, in the beginning of the 19th century, in the 1830s, recognized this and wrote about this back in Europe. Now, what happened later in the 19th century that really disrupted that? the Civil War was a huge one, right? So the Civil War in the 1860s, later, just 30 years later, started to pull apart not just the country, but also these versions of Protestantism. So the institution of slavery was defended by Christians with the Bible and theology, and was opposed by Christians with the Bible and theology. So that created a religious and cultural rupture that really started to undo what was happening in that Protestant Christendom, where that Protestant ethos was driving our culture. We had some agreements, and then that started to disperse. Now the other thing that happened that maybe wouldn't come to mind as immediately for you all is the introduction first in Germany, in Europe, and then in the United States of what we call historical critical study of the Bible. So the idea that had still, since the Reformation, been maintained that the Bible was a clearly inspired by God scripture that was completely authoritative, we started to think about it differently from the perspective of history and the evolution and development of the Bible and religious thought. That started to challenge, because the only thing that was authoritative, if Protestants didn't have a pope, what do Protestants have? That's the one authoritative thing. The Bible, right? And once you start to change the way that that's been read for centuries, again, that's another rupture, another disruption. The other one would be Charles Darwin and the idea of evolution, which, as you know, that split, in addition to the Civil War, evolution and other things split Protestantism into liberals and conservatives, or liberals and fundamentalists, that started to appropriate or reject science as with respect to religion. And that created, again, if you look at the history of the Presbyterian Church, two divergent streams of Protestantism, or Presbyterianism in our case, that again created more fissures that disrupted this Protestant expression of Christendom. Now, flash forward to World War I and World War II, and all of the turmoil and anxiety that created around the world, in which in Europe kind of eventually actually was the World War II and the period of decolonialization after World War II is what eventually was the nail in the coffin of European state churches. In the United States, it created an increase in religiosity. So the high point of religion in the United States was in the baby boom era right after World War II, where part of what it meant to be a good American was that you were a Protestant and you went to church. No one asked do you go to church? They said, where do you go to church? So being a good Christian and not being a communist were like the things that really defined what it meant to be a good American in 1950. And that was historically, even before, that was the zenith, that was the high point of religion in the United States. That's when we had our biggest memberships, our biggest participation. And then the next sort of revolution that challenged all of that was all the various social revolutions of the 1960s, cultural revolutions, that again challenged the sort of dominance of this Protestant form of Christendom. And so all of that then gets us back to what I talk about as post-Christendom. We are now firmly in the midst of a post-Christendom trend that is leaving all of that behind and creating something completely different. So next week we'll talk a little bit about what that different thing is, and I always draw pretty heavily on the work of Diana Butler Bass, who I think really has her finger on the pulse of this. We'll look at some other things next week as well. But I want to just pause here. I think we have 10 minutes.
10 minutes.
Okay. To say any comments or questions about this 500-year rush through history. Does this make sense to say, here's where Luther started with a Latin Christendom where Christianity was deeply intertwined with Europe, to where we are now in the United States, where any vested, at one point we were the you could almost say we were the success story of the Reformation, but because of those same thing, like the aspects of individual autonomy and the ability to challenge and question doctrine, and then all these other things, we've now become a situation where what Luther thought would last forever is now quickly deteriorating. Sir?
Just a thought that you might think about this. This path is also the history of man's struggle to find out how best to gain security and be governed. And in the early part of the 20th century, the church provided all of that security and support. As the world became a little bit more, I'll call it wealthy, and Martin Luther came along, he said, well, you know, the church is not so good either. And so then he started to split and say, well, what other kind of governments can we do? The 100-Year War has kind of put a nail in that coffin that we wanted civilian support for our own security.
Right.
And then we've seen a continual deterioration of centralized government into where today you would say we're really more individualistic. And so why do I need a church?
Yeah.
I can do it all myself.
Absolutely, yeah. That's what we'll talk a little bit more next week.
But it's fascinating how the two parallel.
And, I mean, related to that, I mean, I think there's some legitimate questions. Why do I need a government? Right? If I am as wealthy and autonomous as I am, and this isn't just like the 1%, this is, you know, lots of folks in the United States, I think, have that same sort of perspective. We don't need that at all now. We can do this on our own.
And if we have world peace, we don't need government for security.
Your comment about after World War I and World War II, the religiosity increase. Okay, is that, go a little deeper there. Is that where the people are sitting there saying God needs to be on the side of the U.S. or I feel helpless, I need hope?
I think it's more the latter.
Okay.
People in the United States have always said the former.
Yeah.
Like, manifest destiny is the idea that God has ordained this imperialistic takeover of the North American continent, right? So that's always been part of the American DNA. What I think is more happening there is what you saw after 9/11, which was a smaller bump, but an increase in church attendance and religiosity because something catastrophic just happened, and it forces you to say, where is God in the midst of this, and how do I relate to this? World War II, I mean, World War I was bad enough. World War II ratcheted that up a notch. And the tens of millions of Europeans that died, and then the atomic bombs and all the things that were part of that created a sort of global, at least within the Western, and this is what we're talking about, I guess, kind of a Western anxiety that resulted in higher, at least in the United States, in higher participations. Again, it's a different story in Europe, but yeah, I think it's more of that. Sir.
Has anybody analyzed the South Korean story? Isn't that where Protestantism is really growing?
Well, not just in South Korea, in Africa, in South America, Protestantism, especially again Pentecostalism, is on an incredible rise. Now, South Korea is interesting because it's Presbyterian that is really, not just Presbyterianism, but there's way more Presbyterians in South Korea than there are in the United States. If you think about sort of global influence, we are nothing compared to that stream of the Reformed Presbyterian Church. But yeah, the explosion of Christianity in the non-Western world would be a different discussion. But some people, with respect to this notion of Christendom, and Jenkins has a book called The New Christendom. It's all about the shifting of global power from the United States and Europe in terms of Christianity to Africa and South America, which again is creating globally major rifts and struggles. It's less apparent for us because we actually, in the way that we're set up, we don't even think about what Presbyterians in Africa or South America think about us because we're not united in that way. I mean, we have a World Council of Reformed Churches or something. But if you really want to see where that's coming to a head, it's the Anglican Church. The Anglican Communion because the United States is in such a different place than the Anglican churches in the United, or in Africa and other places. There's this global rift, and we experience a little bit of that when our partners in other places in the country start to say, we're not going to partner with you anymore. That's a little different from saying we're going to disrupt, or another one is the Methodist Church, which is a global communion. Again, what's happening in the U.S. church is a little bit out of accord with what's happening in the global Methodist Church. So you see a rupture there. But yeah, that's a big part of it.
What is Islam doing, you know, in terms of numbers? Are they increasing or?
Yeah, in general. And in the United States, they're increasing, not as rapidly as in some other places. Again, 2 years ago, I was in Ghana. The Presbyterian Church in Ghana, and not just the Presbyterian Church, is very evangelistic in trying to grow their church, in part because they perceive a threat of Islam increasing in their country and other places. And they look at
What does Islam have that we don't have?
what does Islam have that we don't have?
A lot of children.
Well, so part of that is, there is a difference, yeah. So like birth rates, and again, Protestants like us sometimes struggle to grow versus Catholics in the U.S. because of a birth rate difference. But so part of it is, yeah, there's more children. I would also say that, and I'm trying not to make a blanket statement about all of Islam, but I think a lot of Muslims, or at least the Muslims that are actually very aggressively evangelistic in the sense that they're trying to make converts and grow, they actually think that it matters. And I don't think we think that it matters, right? I think that when we look at this, most mainline Protestants are fairly content to just let it go, because and this is really where I wanted to end with this. Why does this matter? Like, who cares? Like, because a lot of American Christians in both mainline Protestants and evangelical church, though I think it's a bit of in the evangelical side, it's a bit of talking out of both sides of their mouth, but would say religion should be a private matter, right? It's just about me and God. So really, it doesn't really matter to me personally. If I'm content to come to a church like this and worship God in my way, why should I care that there are like 100,000 less Presbyterians each year? Why should it matter that Christianity has less of a cultural influence than it used to? Why should it matter that we don't have the ear of our government in the way that we might have in the past? And this gets to what you mentioned earlier. Like, we don't have these things. So on the one hand, I think a lot of folks are content to say that's okay because this is just about me and God. But I think if you have a different perspective on the relationship between Christianity and our culture, this is problematic, right? And I guess I personally think that it's either naive or a gross misunderstanding of Christianity in particular, or religion in general, to suggest that what we believe doesn't impact how we live and how we live together, and how that impacts the way that we vote and the kind of government that we envision and the world that we want to live. And so, I mean, I would suggest, and again, this isn't about Presbyterians so much because we have such a small market share, but if it's not our ideology that's shaping hearts and minds, it's going to be someone else's, right? And I guess part of where I'm coming from is that if we actually think there's something valuable to what we're doing and that it matters in the world, we ought to be acting as if it matters, right? If there is something worth preserving, and not just preserving, but expanding, if we think that our way of being Christians and following God makes a difference for us as individuals and for the world as a whole, why aren't we as zealous as some other folks are to try to make that case and to stand on that? And so I think that, if we believe that God cares about the lives of God's children here and now, not just when we die, and again, this is a theological conversation that's worth having, but if it's not just about the afterlife, but if God is equally concerned with the world right now, I think that we can't just be content to fall into deeper and deeper irrelevancy. And this isn't about amassing power to me. This is about, this is where, and I'll stop here. This is for me about a real missional, this is about a mission, right? That God, I think God wants to transform the world. That the world that we live in is not the way God wants it to be. And I think that we have a role to play in that. And the less relevant and the less influence we have, I think the less capable we are of partnering with God in this transformation that Jesus called the emergence of God's kingdom. Right? That's what Jesus preached about. So I actually really don't care that much about churches and growing churches or the long-term survival of the Presbyterian church. If that chart keeps going down to 0, I'm not going to lose a lot of sleep. I might lose my pension, but actually my pension's going to outlive the existence of the church if the numbers are right. And I'm sure they are, because we really know our numbers and our money. But if that goes down to 0, to me that's not as big a deal, because Jesus, I think, is about the growth of the kingdom. And that to me is why this is important. All right. I think we got to stop because you got to go to worship.
Yep.
But so come back next week for the startling conclusion. To this. Next week I will talk more about where I see new things in the church that are trying to create a different way forward. All right. Thanks for your time.